The house was quiet, but something felt wrong. It was late at night in Los Angeles. The street was dark. The lights inside the home were low. The air felt still, like the city was holding its breath. Then everything changed. Police would later say a shocking crime had happened, one that made the whole country stare at California and ask, how could this happen here? News reports spread fast. People didn't sleep well. Doors were double-locked. Parents pulled their children closer. Hollywood felt scared, like the glow of fame couldn't protect anyone anymore. And behind the fear, one question grew louder each day. Who was controlling the people who did this? Because the strangest part wasn't only the crime. It was the idea that the people who carried it out were not acting like normal criminals. They acted like they were following orders, like someone had taken over their minds. And the name that would soon fill newspapers everywhere was Charles Manson. A man who didn't look like a powerful king. A man who didn't have a big job. A man who didn't have a famous title. But he had something else. He had control. And he used it to pull people into his world, where rules didn't matter, families were replaced, and fear was turned into obedience. Here's the cliffhanger. When police started connecting the dots, they realized Manson might not have held the weapon himself, but he may have been the reason the crimes happened at all. And the moment investigators understood that, the case turned into a battle to prove something hard. How do you put a man on trial for controlling minds? Now, let's go back to the beginning, before the headlines, before the fear, before people knew what the Manson family meant. Charles Manson wasn't born famous. He didn't grow up in a safe, stable home. His early life was full of trouble, and he spent much of his youth in and out of institutions. As he got older, he learned something important about people. If you understand what someone wants, you can pull them close. He learned how to talk in a way that made people feel seen. He learned how to sound confident even when he had nothing. He learned how to use attention like a tool. By the late 1960s, America was changing. Many young people felt lost or angry. Some didn't trust the government. Some didn't trust the old rules. Some wanted peace, freedom, and a new way to live. This was the perfect time for someone like Manson. He started gathering followers, mostly young people who were searching for meaning. He promised love and belonging. He acted like he had answers to life's hardest questions. And slowly, he built a group around himself. They called themselves a family. But it wasn't a normal family. In this family, Manson was the center of everything. He decided where they lived. He decided what they did. He decided what truth meant. He used words like magic tricks. He could make people feel special. He could make them feel guilty. He could make them feel afraid. And then he could make them feel safe again. Only if they stayed loyal to him. This push and pull is how control works. The group moved around and eventually stayed in places where they could live together and avoid outside rules. They spent time in the desert. They stayed in rough areas. They lived in a world that felt separate from everyone else. And the more separate they became, the more Manson's control grew. Some followers stopped calling their parents. Some stopped thinking about school or jobs. Some stopped making choices on their own. They listened to Manson. They repeated his words. They believed he was guiding them to something bigger. Manson also had big dreams of being a music star. He talked about fame like it was guaranteed. He believed the world owed him attention. But when fame didn't come the way he wanted, his anger grew. And the group around him felt that anger. They felt his mood changes. They felt his pressure. They felt his rules getting tighter. This is where the story turns darker. Because Manson didn't just want followers. He wanted obedience. He wanted people to prove loyalty. And when a leader like that wants proof, it can lead to danger. By 1969, tension was building. Manson talked in scary, confusing ways about society and chaos. He made his followers believe they were part of something huge, like a mission. And the more they believed, the more they stopped questioning. In normal life, if someone says something wrong, you argue. In a controlled group, you don't argue. You accept it. You obey. And soon, that obedience would lead to an extreme moment, one that would change America forever. because police would later say Manson gave directions that pushed his followers toward a path of violence. And the night it happened, the crimes were so shocking that people couldn't believe it was real. The next morning, Los Angeles felt different. People read the news and stared at their TVs with wide eyes. Neighbors talked in low voices. Some people didn't want to go outside. The city that always felt loud and confident suddenly felt scared. Police were confused too. At first, the crime didn't make sense. There was no clear reason. No simple motive. No easy explanation. It looked like chaos. But detectives don't stop at confusion. They start there. They walked through the scene carefully. They took notes. They photographed everything. They talked to neighbors. They asked the same question again and again. Who would do this? And while the city panicked, the people behind it didn't look like the kind of criminals detectives expected. They were young. They didn't live like normal people. They moved in a strange group, like they belonged to one person more than they belonged to themselves. And at the center of that group was Charles Manson. Manson wasn't a celebrity in the normal way, but his followers treated him like he was a king, like he was a prophet, like his words were law. In the places where they lived together, he controlled the air they breathed. He controlled the rules. He controlled how they thought. If someone questioned him, he would twist the conversation until the person felt guilty. If someone wanted to leave, he would make them feel afraid of the outside world. He told them the world was broken. He told them only he could guide them. And slowly, his followers stopped thinking of their own future. They thought only about his. This is the low part of the story, how control grows quietly. But then the high, extreme part hit. Detectives began connecting crimes to a group living a hidden life outside the normal city. A break came when one of the followers was arrested for a separate crime. While in custody, that person began talking. And what came out was terrifying. The followers spoke about a family. They spoke about a leader. They spoke about orders. Police began hearing the name Manson again and again. At first, it sounded impossible. How could one man, who didn't even seem powerful, be tied to crimes that shook the nation? But then investigators discovered something important. Control doesn't always look like muscles or money. Sometimes control looks like a voice, a smile, a promise, a threat, a story that makes people believe they can't survive without you. As detectives dug deeper, they learned where the group lived. They learned how they moved around. They learned how Manson kept them isolated. Then police raided the property where the family was staying. They found a strange world. It looked less like a home and more like a camp. People lived close together. They followed odd routines. They spoke in ways that sounded like they had rehearsed their answers. And there was Manson. Small, intense, watching everyone closely. Not like a man surprised to see police. More like a man measuring them. The investigation grew fast. Evidence began to build. Witnesses spoke. Connections formed. And soon, prosecutors began preparing for a case unlike anything people had seen. Because the biggest challenge wasn't only proving who committed the crimes. The challenge was proving this. That Charles Manson controlled the people who did it. That he was the reason it happened. That his words were the weapon. This is the extreme moment where the story rises again. Manson and several followers were arrested and charged. News cameras flashed as they were taken into custody. America watched and asked, how did this happen? How did young people become so controlled? And the strangest part was still coming. Because in court, Manson didn't act scared. He acted like he was still in charge. He stared at people. He smirked. He tried to intimidate witnesses. And his followers, some of them still looked at him like he mattered more than the courtroom. It felt like the control was still there, even behind bars. That's why the case became more than a crime case. It became a story about manipulation, about how someone can shape minds, about how dangerous a leader can be without ever holding a weapon. And this brings us to the extreme ending of Chapter 2. As the trial prepared to begin, prosecutors realized they weren't just fighting for conviction. They were fighting against Manson's influence itself. Because even with the whole world watching, Manson still had one goal: to prove he could control the room. The courtroom was packed. Cameras waited outside. Reporters filled the benches. Families of the victims sat quietly, holding each other, trying to stay strong. And then Charles Manson walked in. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't look scared. He looked confident, almost proud. That alone disturbed people. This was the man accused of controlling others to commit terrible crimes, and yet he walked into court like he still believed he was in charge. From the very start, the trial felt different from anything America had seen before. Manson spoke out of turn. He stared at the jury. He whispered to his followers. He tried to distract, confuse, and intimidate. At one point, he even carved a symbol into his forehead, turning himself into a spectacle. But prosecutors stayed focused. They didn't just talk about what happened. They talked about how it happened. They explained how Manson used fear and loyalty like tools. How he broke people down, then rebuilt them in his image. How he convinced them that hurting others was part of a mission. Witnesses took the stand. Some were former followers. Their voices shook as they explained how Manson controlled their thoughts. How he decided what they believed. How they stopped seeing the world clearly. They described how he told them they were nothing without him. That the outside world was evil. That only the family mattered. And slowly, the jury began to understand something terrifying. These crimes didn't begin with violence. They began with words. The defense tried to argue that Manson never directly committed the acts himself, that he couldn't be blamed for what others chose to do. But prosecutors pushed back hard. They showed that leadership can be dangerous, that ordering, encouraging, and controlling can be just as powerful as acting, that if you control the mind, you control the action. As the trial went on, the hold Manson had over his followers started to crack. Some began to distance themselves. Some stopped looking at him. Some finally admitted they were afraid of him. And that fear, the same fear that once kept them loyal, now helped expose the truth. In the end, the jury reached its decision. Charles Manson was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. The man who once claimed control over others would spend the rest of his life behind bars, watched, limited, powerless. When the verdict was read, there was no celebration. Only silence. Because nothing could undo what had been done. Families had lost loved ones. Lives had been destroyed. And the country had learned a painful lesson. The Manson case changed how America looked at cults. People began to understand that danger doesn't always look loud or violent at first. Sometimes it looks like kindness. Sometimes it looks like belonging. Sometimes it looks like someone saying, "I understand you." But behind that comfort can be control. Charles Manson never became the music star he dreamed of being. He became something else entirely. A warning. A reminder of how fragile the human mind can be when someone knows how to manipulate it. And even decades later, his name still brings chills. Not because of who he was, but because of what he proved was possible. That one man, with the right words at the right time, can convince others to give up their freedom and their conscience. And that is why the story of Charles Manson is still told today. Not to glorify him, but to remember the danger of blind loyalty. And to remind us that the most powerful weapon is not always something you can see. Sometimes it's a voice.